And so, for example, Francisco Ayala, an evolutionary biologist at the University of California, Irvine, calculates from an evolutionary perspective that the probability would be less than 10 to the 1 millionth power. So if you wanted to calculate the probability, it'd be 0.0000, where you got 999,999 zeros between the decimal point and the 1. That's how tiny the probability is under that optimistic perspective. But 3 physicists have jumped in and have made the point that Francisco Ayala ignored the fact that we're living in a changing environment. You know, from a strictly, if you're assuming a constant benign environment for the past 3.8 billion years, yeah, the probability is 10 to the minus 1 millionth power. But if you introduce the changes that take place in the physical environment, the solar system, the Earth, and the Moon, the probability drops to 10 to the minus 24 millionth power.
The news gets worse.
It gets worse. Well, when you got 24 million zeros between the decimal point and the 1, I mean, from all practical purposes, the probability is 0. And Francisco Ayala and these 3 physicists actually use this as an argument against the existence of extraterrestrial life elsewhere in the universe. They say, with a probability that tiny, this is the only place it could have ever happened, but from a naturalistic perspective, it shouldn't have happened here. Or to put it in a more potent way, we human beings, from a naturalistic perspective, are impossible. There's no way we should exist given these extremely tiny probabilities. So this really would imply we must be here because of a supernatural explanation, because from a naturalistic perspective, the probability is indistinguishable from 0.
Yes, all right. Nevertheless, there are people who have heard scientific reports and they've maybe learned something about Neanderthals, seen them in the news, and have wondered about a genetic connection. What do we know about the DNA of Neanderthals and modern humans?
Well, that's what's exciting about being alive in the 21st century. We now have DNA that we can bring into this human origins debate. Not just human DNA, but Neanderthal DNA. And, when the book went to press, we had recovered DNA from 15 different Neanderthal specimens. And as we look at those 15 specimens, what we see is that Neanderthal as a species did not experience any significant evolution. The DNA amongst those 15 specimens is remarkably similar. As it is, by the way, when you dig up dead humans that have been dead for tens of thousands of years. Their DNA compared to our DNA today, hardly any difference. So it shows that the human species over the past 50,000 years has not experienced any significant evolution. Likewise, Neanderthals haven't experienced any evolution. And when we compare Neanderthal DNA to human DNA, it is so different that we realize that humans could not possibly have evolved from Neanderthals. The story now is that they have a common ancestor. But given that we see no evolution in the DNA of either humans or Neanderthals, how could they be descended from a common ancestor? But the common ancestor they pick up on is Homo erectus,
right,
which existed, 200,000 to 1.8 million years ago. And that's so far back in time, there's really no chance of recovering untainted or uncorrupted or undecayed DNA. But we do have lots of bones. And what we notice there is that the most ancient Homo erecti bones are identical to the most recent. So from the perspective of the fossils, we can't see any evidence that over 1.6 million years, Homo erectus has experienced any significant evolution. And this is kind of making the point that we have in the book, is if you look at all these bipedal primate species, we don't see the claimed evidence for evolutionary change. We see lots of species, and we can see that they have distinct differences with respect to one another, but there's no tree. What we see is a lawn. We see separate species that show up without change and without any visible connection with respect to one another, which is exactly what you would anticipate if a creator was responsible for all these species we see over the past 6.5 million years.
Hugh, just a question on terminology. Bipedal primates, would that also be known as hominids? So would you put Neanderthals and Homo erectus in the hominid bipedal? Right. Okay, and modern humans are not in that lineage then?
Well, we humans are also referred to as hominids. Hominid is a term that refers to any creature that is bipedal and has a brain size that's bigger than, say, that of a chimpanzee.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's human, just means it has those two characteristics. But we human beings, as we argue in the book, are unique in that we are spiritual in nature, and also we see no physical connection with any other bipedal primate species.
And then a quick question on dates for those new to Reasons to Believe and the positions we espouse here. The dates for humans, I think you said as far back as 50,000. And then for Neanderthals, where would their dates lie?
Well, there's 4 lines by which you can get dates for the origin of humanity. One is from the Bible, where you calibrate the Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies. And the date you get there is roughly 50,000 years ago. Although I would argue the error bar is probably in the neighborhood of plus or minus 30,000 years.
Okay.
But we show you in the book how you can calibrate those genealogies. Then another way you can do it is through mitochondrial DNA, looking at the DNA on the mother's side. And the date you see in the published literature is 150,000 years ago, but that's assuming that every human being only gets one set of mitochondrial DNA from their mother. The fact is 10% of us get 2 sets and 1% of us get 3 sets. And when you take into account heteroplasmy and triplasmy, you'll wind up with a date for the first woman roughly 50,000 years ago. With Y chromosome, you don't have that problem. And that's looking at the origin of humanity on the male side. And there you get a date of about 46 to 54,000 years ago, 50,000 years approximately, and that's actually a fairly accurate date. We get a more accurate date through Y chromosome than we do through any other dating technique. And then you can look at the cultural Big Bangs. We've already said humanity is uniquely spiritual, and it's our spiritual characteristic that allows us to quickly manifest certain features that are picked up in the cultural finds. The first humans immediately started wearing clothing. We're the only species that wears clothing, if you discount the dogs at dog shows.
That's right.
But we put the clothes on them.
Yeah.
They don't put clothes on themselves. So we see this clothing Big Bang. You see a jewelry Big Bang. We're the one species that makes and wears jewelry. You see this advanced tool Big Bang, an art Big Bang, a music Big Bang. We see a religious Big Bang. And so these Big Bangs are unique to the human species, and they all date in the neighborhood of about 40,000 years ago, which is really what you'd expect for a 50,000-year origin for humanity, because it takes a population growth and a civilization growth before you're going to have accumulated archaeological finds. Mm-hmm. So from those 4 different methods, we're getting dates that are coming in the neighborhood of 50,000 years ago, although except for the Y chromosome, none of those dates are that accurate.
And those things that you talked about as part of the cultural Big Bangs, would those be evidence for the Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei, image of God in humanity?
Exactly.
Okay. So the other hominids do not show those features?
They do not show those features, although with the late Neanderthals, because Neanderthals overlapped human beings a little bit.
I was going to ask you about the dates for Neanderthals.
Yeah, they come in at about 150,000 years ago to about 30,000 years ago, so there's some overlap with human beings. And from what we can tell, Neanderthals are like the great apes that share the planet with us today, especially the monkeys and the baboons. They steal stuff from us. So we notice with the late Neanderthals, it appears that they were picking up or borrowing tools that have been left behind by human beings, but we see no evidence that they were at all effective in using them. Kind of reminds me of a bunch of monkeys I saw when I was in Japan, where they were all carrying Coke cans in their hands. They weren't using the Coke cans, but they found enough that they could steal from the ditch